In this video, I'm going to demonstrate the capabilities of EoD on demand as a way of logging on to and working with the cluster. So we'll start by launching EoD on demand. I'm working on a Mac here, so the client looks perhaps slightly differently than it looks on a PC, but the function is basically the same. Launching the client, you're presented with a screen in which you enter the name of the host you want to log on to, which in this case is the ACI interactive host, aci-i.aci.ics.psu.edu. You put your user ID, you type your password. And then the system prompts you for a two-factor authentication, the simplest of which is to use the push to your phone. Once you respond to that push, after a short period, you'll be presented with a second screen in which you make a choice about the way in which you want to log on to the machine. Here I've chosen a desktop mode in which what will be launched is a picture of a sort of virtual desktop, as if I were logged on as a personal user of the cluster, and the so-called Gnome desktop, a kind of clone, if you want, of a Windows or Mac desktop, will be launched. This takes a few moments to open, and then eventually we get, as I said, this virtual desktop for working on the cluster. So it has several useful tools already defined. For example, this icon that says STM9's home is an icon that will open a browser into my home directory on the cluster. This is the file browser. Within that, I can browse in a more or less intuitive fashion. And once I get to a level of files instead of folders, then if these files are openable with the text editor, for example, I think clicking on one of them, I should be able to choose, maybe with control click, no, let's see, with command click, I can open it with different text editors. The default being Gedit, which is a visual editor. So, for example, if I open this script called heat.sh, sh for shell script, basically a reminder that this is a script, then I can open that with Gedit and type in here and change that script if I want to, with open and save dialogues and search and replace and that sort of thing, which is familiar to anyone who's worked on a modern Windows type machine. So I'll close that and close this browser. If I look under the Applications menu, there are a variety of applications that are available. There's the text editor again, which will open it without pointing it at any particular file. Here there is a browser if you particularly need to launch a browser from within the cluster, which you almost never do. Here are some Microsoft Office clones. Again, I wouldn't encourage working with those things on the cluster necessarily. Here is perhaps the most important tool, which is called the terminal. So this is how you get a command line prompt within the ACI cluster and this virtual desktop. So here I can use all the old school Unix commands that I'm familiar with from long practice. So I can print the working directory. It starts me out in my home directory. I can cd, I can ls to see what's in there. I can change directory cd to a subdirectory like work. I can ls again to see what's in there. This is sort of the pattern of working, moving from one directory to another. in a non-Windows environment. Another important thing that I can do in this terminal window is I can open other tabs, which are, as it were, independent sessions. So I've opened another terminal tab, and I'm going to cd to nowhere, which takes me to my home directory, storage home stm9. And from this point, I can launch many different programs of a visual nature on ACII. For example, once again, the terminal, the editor Gedit. And here I'm going to Gedit a hidden file. Starts with a dot. That's how you know it's hidden. Bashrc. The bashrc file is the file that stores a bunch of settings and shortcuts and things that are defined whenever you launch a new terminal session or a new terminal tab or what have you. So if I open mine with this editor, you can see what kind of things are in there. For example, there are these aliases, and there is the alias ACIB, which is defined to be this command here in quotes, which is to secure shell with my ID to ACI-B, etc. In other words, to log on to ACIB. So when I typed ACIB earlier to launch a session with the batch side of ACI, I was using that alias. There are other things in the bashrc file which are called modules, and the module load command loads a piece of software that would not ordinarily be available to you if you didn't load it. So, for instance, here I load Gaussian, the program that we use for doing molecule-based density functional calculations. And I load Mathematica and some other things as well. Another kind of change that you can make in the bashrc file is to add additional folders to your path. The path is the Unix variable that tells Unix where to look for files when you try to execute them. It doesn't just look anywhere, it looks at a specific subset of folders. And so when you add a directory to the path, that makes the executable files in that folder available to be launched without typing their full path name. So I have a locally compiled version of VMD, for example, which is sitting in this particular directory, and in order to have access to it by just typing VMD, I add that to the path. So I'm going to close this now. We can see the workings of this path business by using the command which. So which VMD asks Unix, in effect, can you find this VMD command? And you see it finds it in the directory that I added to my path. And if I want to see here what the path is, I can echo the variable value of the path. The dollar in front of the word path says the value of the variable path, and if I echo it, that just means print it to the screen. And here are all the directories that Unix has been told to look in, separated by colon. So here's a directory I've added, and another one, and so on. So those are the various places that it looks. As I mentioned before, we can launch many programs from the command line that are not, for example, available over here in the set of pull-down menus. In particular, I can launch, say, Mathematica. Mathematica takes a moment to load. We see this sort of welcome icon, and then we have a screen very much like the one if we ran Mathematica on a Mac or a PC, so that at this point, if I type, something like plot sine of x for x from 0 to 2 pi, and hit Shift Return in the usual way to execute the line, I will, after the kernel launches, which also takes a brief moment, get a plot. Once the kernel launches, the response time is much faster. As you can see. The dialog boxes here work in more or less the same way as they would on a Mac or a PC, except that when you're saving things, you're saving them to some directory on the cluster itself, on ACI. So I'm not going to save this. I'm just going to quit out. To launch the visual interface to the program Gaussian, the command is gv, which is short for GaussView. So if I type gv and hit return, then after a little tiny moment, we get the program GaussView, which has a visual interface for building molecules and setting up calculations using density functional theory to calculate properties of these molecules. And again, this has menus and dialog boxes and so on. I have a separate presentation on how to use this program for the purposes that we'll explore. For now, I'm just going to close this program. When you want to finish with a terminal session, it's good form to exit that, which will stop the session and kill the tab rather than just clicking this little box up here. And so I'll just exit all of these one after the other. At this point, I can certainly, without any problem, log out of this overall session of Gnome desktop access to ACII. So now I'm going to demonstrate logging on to ACI in a different way using a more recently developed web-based portal that not only gives access to a desktop of the sort that we were looking at before, but also some other useful utilities and features for interacting with ACI. So this is called the ACI portal, and for example, it's got a file browser capability which has upload and download feature. That is, you can upload and download files to whatever local machine you're working on, here my Mac laptop. So I will launch this in a new tab, and you can see that I have a browser here that allows me to look at the files on the cluster. So for example, the same directory we were looking at previously, but I can download these, you can see, and it's also possible to upload files from this local machine to the cluster. So that's a useful feature, enabling you to transfer files back and forth to the cluster. So if I take this file here and highlight it and then hit download, I will be warned about the trouble I might be causing, but I can download it and it will wind up somewhere, probably in my downloads folder. Yes. And likewise upload. So that's how the File Explorer works on this web-based ACI portal. There are also some interactive apps, for example, Jupyter, which is a Python notebook interface, MATLAB, and so forth, that have been set up here. Our main interest at the moment is the ACI Interactive Desktop. So if I click this link, I will be given the opportunity to launch an interactive session, and here I actually get multiple nodes, 4 cores worth of computing power, which is somewhat better than what you get when you log on to ACI normally, for a certain number of hours. Here I'm specifying that these cores are to be allocated out of the open allocation, and again it's the Gnome desktop that I'm requesting. So when I press launch here, this doesn't happen immediately. It goes into a queue, and this queue might take 5 minutes or so to activate my session, and eventually there will be an indication on this screen that the session is ready. So apparently now my session is just about to start and I get this hopeful looking message. And finally, the session is ready to launch. So if I click this button, then I get the same desktop that we saw before with basically the same capabilities as before. Here's the very same menu of capabilities and the very same file browser opens if I click on that home folder icon, and I can, as before, open a terminal window in the same fashion. And if I log out again here, then that will terminate the session. It's not possible, as you can see, to reconnect, even though there's this hopeful looking connect link. Once you've logged out, you're done. To log out of the portal itself, you use this button over here. And then you close your browser.